Welcome back to Boyd Book Club. Talking today in episode 5 of our second semester about 2 more filters of orientation. Going to be talking today about our previous experiences and our access to new information. And I'm calling this episode Building Snowmobiles because we spend a lot of time talking about Boyd's theories, talking about Boyd's ideas, and his description of snowmobile building as a destructive and creative relationship, which it is. However, we can't neglect to understand how those filters of orientation apply to our ability to build snowmobiles. So when we think about the destructive and creative process of building snowmobiles, we need to understand that these 2 filters that we haven't discussed yet, previous experience and new information, play as central of a role in our dialectic engine, in our ability to analyze, destruct, and synthesize, construct new ideas. It is how our previous experiences and both our access to new information and our willingness to see information in novel ways, it's how we incorporate that information that has a direct role on our ability to analyze and synthesize. So if we think about Boyd's snowmobile project, his snowmobile metaphor, right? We begin with a set of objects. We begin with a snow skier, a motorboat, a tractor, and a bicycle. When we see those 4 constituent elements, we use our previous experience to understand what they are. We don't have a priori knowledge of what they are, a priori knowledge before experience, in contrast to a posteriori knowledge that comes after our experience. There's an interesting discussion to be had about the limits of both a priori and a posteriori knowledge. It's a deeper conversation than I think we have time for here. What orientation points us towards is the notion, is the belief, for lack of a better term, that there is no a priori knowledge. All of our knowledge, in some degrees or respects, is a posteriori. It is knowledge based upon our experience. And we're going to get into that in some detail in a few minutes. So it's only through experience that we become familiar with the actual objects that Boyd is talking about, the skier, the motorboat, the tractor, and the bicycle. And it's not only through experience that we have relation to them as actual objects, but also as concepts, as a cognitive domain, as frameworks for understanding. This is where both previous experience and our willingness to see things as new information comes into play when we start talking about building snowmobiles and how those 2 filters of orientation shape our ability to analyze and synthesize. If we are going to look at those now familiar objects of the skier, the motorboat, the tractor, and the bicycle as reified objects, as concrete objects that only exist as their whole that we can see them, we are limited, right? We are limiting the access to seeing them in a novel way, as seeing them as new information. So in this way, our previous experience exists both as a tool for understanding, but it also places limits on the ways we are able to see what is unfolding in our environment and the objects and concepts that are presented in novel and interesting ways. Previous experience can limit our access to new information. We can think of it this way. There's the old adage that if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And that has an element of truth in it. However, if we allow ourselves to see the hammer in a novel way, in a new way, now we're able to use our analytic and synthetic process to expand the ways that we might be able to use that hammer. That hammer can be a doorstop if we choose to see it as something other than the concept of a hammer. We're going to get into how this all plays together a little bit more. So I want to look at previous experience now in detail, and I want to look at it in two lights. The first is to look at previous experience as a hermeneutic tool. And when we talk about a hermeneutic tool, we are talking about a tool for understanding and comprehending the meaning of something. Hermeneutics is most often used to describe the understanding of textual relationships, but text is merely one way of communicating information. And where hermeneutics becomes particularly important in the context of our previous experiences is our interpretation of what we have learned and what our experiences are, which have, I think, a textual quality to them, in that they are not something that we are doing or experiencing in the moment. Rather, they are a set of stored information that we are trying to reference back and understand. If we think about the video that we looked at for this week, Catherine Schultz's TED Talk, we remember her discussing the idea that she didn't understand what this quote-unquote Chinese character on the side of the road was, right? The symbol for picnic area ahead. And having access to that knowledge in the moment is a tool, but understanding that knowledge, it is a semantical relationship that requires a linguistic understanding. It's a semiotic system, and our knowledge of our previous experiences and our ability to interpret our previous experiences clearly, to me, are also semiotic systems. So I think the idea of looking at previous experience as a hermeneutic tool has value. The second way that we can look at our previous experiences is as a set of skills, as a skill repertoire, as a skill repertoire, as Boyd describes it. And in this case, our previous experiences fall into a category of learned abilities, learned skills that we are then brought out to play in the world. In that way, we want to talk about an analog to cultural tradition, right? In discussing cultural tradition, we talked about knowns, unknowns, and unknown unknowns. When we start talking about previous experience, I want to talk about how three different factors play into our way of using our previous experiences, both as hermeneutic tools and as skill repertoires. First, we have what I call active learning. Active learning can be any sort of cognitive or behavioral skill that we are both setting out to learn, or that another individual, a teacher, a parent, a mentor, an instructor, is setting out to develop our ability with. This is where we are using that system that BSA, Boy Scouts of America, in their programming refers to as the EDGE method, where we explain something, demonstrate it, guide somebody to developing a skill, and then enable them to use that skill. This is the process of teaching a firefighter how to go through their SCBA emergency procedures. This is the process of teaching your child to read. This is the process of learning how to drive a car. Active learning is exactly that. It is an explicit process of learning and building both hermeneutic tools and skill repertoires. So the second aspect of previous experience and developing previous experience that I want to talk about is what I refer to as tacit learning. And tacit learning is those set of hermeneutic tools and skill repertoires that we are developing not in an explicit way, but that our parents, teachers, mentors, instructors have a intention to shape in us. These are previous experiences. These are ideas that we are being exposed to. These are skill sets that we are being asked to practice. But it is without our active understanding that we are engaged in learning. So there is still an active component to tacit learning. It is active in the intention of the instructor, of the teacher, but it is less active of a process on the part of you, the learner. So, for example, if I am discussing one of my many asides, perhaps there is tacit learning that I am trying to point out. There is something that I want you to take away from that. But because it is not on topic, so to speak, you are not as actively engaged in learning the material. You don't necessarily see it as something that I am teaching you. Rather, it's just Chris talking as he works his way through this material, right? So there is both active learning and tacit learning occurring all at the same time. The last aspect of learning and the development of previous experience that I want to talk about is unconscious learning. And unconscious learning is that learning that is happening without either the mentor or the mentee being aware that learning is occurring, right? These are the implicit traits, the unconscious traits that we pick up from our parents and our youth, the implicit understandings that we don't even recognize that we have learned and developed a set of hermeneutic understanding as well as a set of skill repertoires that we apply. Unconscious learning, the unconscious learning that we have done, is often the work of therapy to deconstruct and to understand and to bring to the surface. In many respects, that is what the Freudian process of psychoanalysis is about. It's trying to uncover that unconscious learning. We are able to work much more readily on our actively learned skills than we are on our tacitly learned skills. We are able to work on our tacitly learned skills much more effectively and quickly than we are on our unconsciously learned skills. And in the context of previous experience, that understanding, the hermeneutics, and belief systems that come along with that, as well as the skill repertoires that we've built to handle the world, all are impacted by these three types of learning. And to then use the OODA loop as a tool, like we've been discussing, we need to do the process of understanding what we have actively learned and what we have actively taught, what we have tacitly learned and what we have tacitly taught, and critically examine what we have unconsciously learned and internalized as true, as fact, and those things that we have been teaching unconsciously, and bring those to the domain of consciousness. There's a quote from Carl Jung that I like quite a bit, and I have for years, and it says that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but rather by making the darkness conscious. It is in examining our previous experiences and the unconscious learning that has occurred in previous experience that we expand our capacity to use the OODA loop as a tool on a much higher level. Continuing then to look at and think about Catherine Schultz's TED Talk on being wrong, I want to talk now about this idea that she brings up, that being wrong feels like being right. And Schultz references a quote back to one of her discussions about the idea that, that the interest, the novelty that we experience in learning comes from this idea that I thought one thing was going to happen, but something else happened instead, right? That's the exposure to novelty, but it's also the recognition of novelty. When we find I thought one thing was going to happen, but something else did, interesting and exciting, it is because we are recognizing novelty and the opportunity to learn something. When we find it upsetting and distressing, it is because there is a dissonance that is occurring between our hermeneutic and skill repertoires, our previous experiences, and how they are limiting our access to that new information. And what we are experiencing in the moment. Right? So I've talked before about how the access to new information helps prevent intellectual entropy. And in that way, the access to new information is much like when we go in and we upgrade a computer, right? When we go in and we upgrade a computer, we are going in and we are putting new information into a system that is ideally going to speed it up, that is going to help it work more effectively, more efficiently. We are hoping to close oftentimes security gaps in the code that open it to malicious actors. All of these upgrades are ways of preventing entropy within the system, of preventing disorder from increasing within the system, if the upgrade is a good one. We have all had experiences of upgrading a device and having that device bricked by the upgrade because the information that was contained within the upgrade did not actually improve the device. It was labeled an upgrade, and in fact what it did was take away the functionality of the tool. In this way, that is where we have to be critical of the new information that we are being exposed to. And we need to critically examine that new information in reference to our previous experience, our cultural traditions, our genetic heritage, and push it through a process of active learning. Our access to new information, if it is only unconscious learning, is going to increase those dissonances more often than not. And if it does not increase those dissonances, it may only be through happenstance. And what we want is to avoid luck in this equation as much as possible. Luck is always part of it. We are always just getting lucky. And that is part of the uncertainty of the universe, part of the uncertainty principle that applies, and also partially something like the incompleteness principle. We can't just know all of the facts that we need to have. We don't know how these postulates, this new information, is going to affect the system until we try it. But that is where that explicit process of learning that happens in the simulation loops of the OODA loop help us understand what is occurring. Understanding how the 4 filters of orientation shape our ability to analyze and synthesize, and thus have a central role in how we are implicitly and explicitly guided to see and act in the world is critical. Taking the time to deep dive our understanding of these things is worthwhile. It is something that happens, much like the rest of the OODA loop, in an iterative process. As we begin to question those things that we believe, as we begin to question those things that we know, as we begin to question those things that we do, it enables us to then ask further refining questions. That is a wholly worthwhile endeavor. To be sure, it is an endeavor that will make you feel and behave neurotically at times. And it's probably a habit that comes most readily to the neurotic because we have a tendency to hyperanalyze everything to begin with. But I think it as a skill, it can help us build our capacity to use the OODA loop effectively. Thank you to the Patreons who support making these videos and making them happen. Please encourage other people to become Patreons of the channel. Or if you're not interested in being a Patreon, or you know somebody who isn't being interested in being a Patreon and having that monthly commitment, encourage them to go visit the Adult Academy website. Buy a book, buy a download, buy a t-shirt, something like that. It helps keep us able to do this work. As always, thank you for taking some time out of your day to spend with me. I appreciate it. I'll see you soon. Cheers.